When Top Gun Maverick hit the theaters, it was a must-see for my wife, who counts the original one as one of her favorite 80s flicks. And now, having seen it, I have to say that it was absolutely incredible. Just a good, old-fashioned, feel-good movie that was surprisingly clean and, bonus, agenda-free. Director Joseph Kosinski has said, quote, "The film is really a competition film. It's more of a sports movie in terms of its structure," end quote. And that's exactly how it feels. The dogfights, both real and the training versions, were some of my favorite scenes in both movies. High drama, high action, high skill, fast thinking, just a real cinematic adrenaline rush. Not unlike one of my personal all-time favorite movies, Independence Day, in which pilots go up against an alien enemy that is simply overpowering in almost every way imaginable. In all three of the aforementioned flicks, when the good guys realize that the enemy has locked onto them with their weapon system, it just feels like all hope is nearly lost, like they're sitting ducks against a smarter, more powerful, more relentless enemy. And life is like that sometimes. And sometimes the enemy even uses our own weapons against us. In the previous episode, I said that we have one brain with two minds. Mind one is driven by whatever's easiest. It wants you to act on impulse, and it demands immediate gratification. Mind two is driven by your values. It wants you to do the hard thing by controlling your impulse and delaying gratification in favor of long-term goals and values. Now, make no mistake, the two versions of you are in a constant war, a war for control. I mean, aren't all wars about power and control after all? And since this is a war, there are weapons involved. And naturally speaking, emphasis on the word naturally, Mind one has an unfair and unevenly weighted advantage in the weapons department. Your short-term impulses are like Goliath against your ruddy, long-term goals. More about that in a bit. Many years ago, two researchers were trying to activate an area of the brain that would create a fear response in rats. But instead, there was one seemingly masochistic rat that kept returning to the corner of the cage where it had been shocked. It seemed to be hoping for another shock. So much so that the researchers could literally operate the rat like a joystick. Was the rat psychotic? Well, maybe, but that was beside the point. Turns out, researchers planted the electrode in the wrong part of the rat's brain. And after puzzling over this, they came to the conclusion that they had clearly found the pleasure center of the brain. After even more research, they realized that they were wrong again. That rat wasn't experiencing bliss, it was experiencing desire, an important and very critical distinction. Once the rat figured out that he could press a lever and stimulate this desire for reward, he couldn't stop himself, and he gave himself shocks every 5 seconds. But, and here's the really sad part, the shock was an artificially created experience. So his brain was getting the anticipation of reward without ever actually getting the reward. And it was the same with all the other rats. They would continue to press the lever until they actually collapsed from exhaustion. Researchers then decided to kick it up a notch and tried it with humans. Same exact response. The human guinea pigs averaged 40 shocks per minute. Another participant continued to press the button over 200 times after the current was turned off, until the experimenter finally demanded that he stop. Now, rats can't talk, but humans can, and one human participant described the feeling of self-stimulation as intensely frustrating. He was never able to achieve the sense of satisfaction that he felt like he was so close to experiencing. The shocks, which caused him to endlessly anticipate a reward, left him anxious, but never happy. They thought if they just pressed that lever one more time, something truly wonderful was going to happen. For sure, this time, like a gambler at a slot machine, just one more time. This is really going to pay off this time. I just know it, but it rarely ever does. It's just an empty promise. Researchers hadn't discovered the pleasure center. They had discovered the reward system. It propels us toward action and consumption. Each time the area was activated, their brains told them, hey, do that again. It will definitely make you happy next time. But the stimulation itself never brought satisfaction. It turns out that the signal that, quote, this will make you happy, end quote, isn't always accurate and might even be a big, fat lie. So how does the reward system compel us to act? Well, let me go back to those Top Gun Independence Day dogfights for a minute. In the world of warfare, one common type of missile system is called a pursuit system. As the name signifies, the fired missile in this system automatically stays on the target and continues pursuit until it makes the hit. At the head of the missile is usually some type of tracking system, like a radar system or an infrared optical sensor that tracks and pursues the target. And while the missile is flying, the tracking system keeps it relentlessly locked onto a target. So Mind One is like a short-term pleasure-seeking missile in your brain. And when it sees a chance of reward, it goes after that reward with fervor and gusto. How does it do that? Well, it releases a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Dopamine is your brain's internal pursuit system. It gives Mind One, that short-term, impulsive brain of yours, the ability to achieve tone and lock on a target, and then guides us impulsively toward the so-called opportunity. Dopamine tells the rest of the brain what to pay attention to get locked onto or fixated on. But, and this is important, a dopamine-guided Mind One missile doesn't create happiness itself. It creates desire or anticipation by promising happiness and pleasure. We recognize the possibility, and then we're willing to do whatever it takes to experience that promise. So what happens in your brain whenever you get hooked by the promise of reward? We're driven to chase pleasure, but often at the cost of our well-being. When dopamine puts our brains on a reward-seeking mission, we become the most risk-taking, impulsive, and out-of-control version of ourselves, driven by Mind One. The promise of reward is enough to keep us hooked. At worst, you may find yourself spiraling into obsession and compulsion. That all sounds like pretty bad news. It sounds like ruddy little Mind Two, with its core values and lofty goals, is a sitting duck against a smarter, more powerful, more relentless dopamine-equipped Mind One. So, is there a way to simply eliminate the heat-seeking missile system? No, and you wouldn't want to. God gave it to you because it serves a purpose when it's aimed at the correct targets. And that's the key. Mind Two can learn to use the same weapon. We need the promise of reward to keep us interested and engaged in life. We need it to have the motivation to pursue good things. But if we're to have any self-control, we need to separate the real rewards that give our lives meaning from the false rewards that keep us distracted and addicted. When dopamine points us to temptation, we must distinguish wanting from happiness. Dopamine isn't the problem. Anticipation and desire aren't the problem. Those things were given to us by God. What matters is what we allow our dopamine targeting system to get locked onto, and whether we have the wisdom to know when the target is good and helpful or simply an empty promise of false reward. I said at the beginning of this episode that sometimes the enemy even uses our own weapons against us, in this case our own brains. Make no mistake, humanity has an enemy who has had thousands of years to perfect his ability to manipulate Mind One and our dopamine reward system. As James 1:13 through 15 says, quote, "When tempted, no one should say, 'God is tempting me.' For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they're dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. Then, after desire has been conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death." End quote. And Philippians 3:18 through 19 says, quote, "For I have told you often before, and I say it again with tears in my eyes, that there are many whose conduct shows they are really enemies of the cross of Christ. They are headed for destruction. Their God is their appetite. They brag about shameful things, and they think only about this life here on earth." End quote. The next time you find yourself craving or desiring something, recognize that it's your brain's pleasure-seeking missile at work. Then ask yourself 2 questions. Number 1, am I locked on to something that will actually produce the fruit of the Spirit in my life? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. That's Galatians 5:22 and 23. Number 2, have I actually fixed my thoughts on something that is true, honorable, right, pure, lovely, admirable, and worthy of praise, according to Philippians 4:8? If the answer isn't yes, you need to take control of that missile and redirect or retarget it immediately. Remember, a better mind always leads to a better life.